The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the quiet streets of Hawthorne Ridge, a small suburban town where life moved at a slower, predictable pace. Among the early risers was James Carter, a 47-year-old black veteran, known in the neighborhood for his firm handshake and warm smile. His stature was imposing, standing at 6 feet 2 inches, with broad shoulders. But his eyes carried a gentle kindness, a reflection of his years spent serving others both in and out of uniform. James had served 22 years in the Army, including 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. His military career had been one of dedication and discipline. He was a man of few words, preferring action over speeches, but when he spoke, people listened. His values of honor, respect, and service were evident in every aspect of his life. Despite the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life, James took pride in his military background and often wore his veteran's cap as a subtle reminder of where he came from. In his post-military life, James had settled into a routine. His mornings began with a brisk 5 a.m. jog through the neighborhood, a habit formed during his years in the service. He'd then stop by Benny's Cafe, a modest but welcoming spot known for its strong coffee and friendly chatter. The cafe was a hub for locals, teachers, retirees, young professionals, all seeking their morning fix of caffeine and community. James enjoyed these brief exchanges, finding comfort in the familiarity of friendly faces and light-hearted conversations. However, James couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in how people treated him once they learned about his military service. While many respected him, others seemed to hold back, unsure of how to connect with a man who had seen and experienced things they couldn't comprehend. This disconnect occasionally weighed on him, though he rarely let it show. Not far from Benny's Cafe was Bradley's Home Supply, a thriving business run by Ethan Bradley, a 45-year-old white man who had built his store from the ground up. Ethan was known for his sharp business acumen and no-nonsense demeanor. He prided himself on efficiency and expected the same from his staff and customers. To Ethan, time was money, and he often grew impatient with customers who lingered or asked too many questions. He valued hard work and success, often unaware of the deeper stories behind the faces that walked into his store. Ethan's store was the go-to place for anyone needing tools, paint, or home improvement advice. It was always bustling with contractors, DIY enthusiasts, and homeowners. Ethan had a reputation for being brusque but knowledgeable, a man who could solve any home repair problem but wasn't one for small talk. His fast-paced world left little room for empathy, and he often overlooked the individuality of his customers, viewing them merely as transactions rather than people with stories. James and Ethan's worlds, though physically close, couldn't have been more different. Where James carried the weight of his experiences quietly, Ethan moved through life with blind ambition, unaware of the personal battles others faced. Yet, there was an undercurrent of tension in the town. Conversations at the cafe occasionally drifted into uneasy territories, discussions of race, respect, and the value of service. James often felt the weight of these societal undertones, sensing that his presence, while generally welcomed, was sometimes met with quiet hesitancy. Similarly, Ethan dismissed these discussions, seeing them as distractions from his focus on business growth. What neither man knew was that their paths were about to cross in a way that would challenge both their perspectives. The town's calm facade was about to be disrupted by a chance encounter that would bring hidden prejudices and forgotten sacrifices to the forefront. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the town seemed to settle into a comfortable rhythm. James Carter, having finished his morning routine and a visit to Benny's Cafe, decided to head over to Bradley's Home Supply. His kitchen faucet had developed a slow but persistent leak, and he needed a replacement part. Despite his calm demeanor, James appreciated the challenge of a good repair job. As he entered the store, the familiar scent of lumber and fresh paint filled the air. The aisles were bustling with customers, each absorbed in their own DIY projects. James moved purposefully, scanning the shelves for the part he needed. He found it, but noticed it was placed too high for him to reach. He spotted a nearby clerk and was about to ask for assistance when Ethan Bradley, the store owner, emerged from behind the counter. Ethan was in the middle of directing a shipment of supplies when he saw James waiting near the plumbing aisle. His mind, preoccupied with stock management, barely registered James as more than another customer. With a quick glance, Ethan walked over, already bracing himself for what he perceived to be a time-consuming inquiry. "What can I help you with?" Ethan asked, his tone brisk, bordering on impatient. James, ever polite, nodded toward the shelf. "I need that replacement valve up there. Could someone help me get it down?" Ethan gave a slight smirk, misinterpreting James' request. "You know, we get a lot of people in here thinking they need something complicated when a simple fix would do. Are you sure you're not overthinking this?" The words landed heavily. James froze for a moment, taken aback by the condescension. He wasn't just a man asking for help. He was a skilled veteran who had led missions under pressure, repaired vehicles in the heat of war, and managed logistics far more complex than a leaking faucet. Yet here he was, being reduced to someone incapable of solving a simple problem. Ethan, unaware of the shift in James' expression, continued, "These valves aren't exactly rocket science. Maybe you should check with someone at home first. Sometimes it's easier to let the experts handle it." There was a long pause. James clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the edge of his shopping cart. His military training had taught him restraint, even under provocation. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was a home supply store, and the battle was one of respect. "Thank you," James finally said, his voice steady, though his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "I'll take it from here." Ethan shrugged, oblivious to the deeper impact of his words. "Suit yourself," he muttered before turning back to his task. James took the valve down with the help of another clerk and moved to the checkout line, his mind racing. What stung wasn't just the dismissal, but the assumption of incompetence. It was a familiar sting, a reminder of the times when his uniform hadn't been enough to earn respect, and now, without it, he was just another nameless customer in the eyes of people like Ethan. The walk back to his car was heavier than usual. James sat in the driver's seat for a few moments, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He wasn't one to dwell on negativity, but this incident had unsettled something deep within him. It wasn't just about him, it was about every veteran, every person overlooked because of assumptions. The impact on his day was immediate. James skipped his usual afternoon walk around the neighborhood and didn't stop by Benny's Cafe for his second cup of coffee. Instead, he retreated to his small workshop at home, attempting to distract himself with tasks. Yet, the disrespect lingered, a cloud over his otherwise peaceful existence. He found himself questioning things he rarely thought about. How many others in the community shared Ethan's dismissive view? Was this an isolated incident or part of a broader, more systemic issue? His mind replayed the encounter, analyzing every word, every dismissive gesture. Despite his attempts to shake it off, James felt a shift in his demeanor. He was no longer just a man running errands. He had become, in that moment, a man confronting a world that didn't fully see him, and it was a realization that he couldn't easily set aside. The next day, the atmosphere in Bradley's home supply was tense. Word of Ethan's dismissive encounter with James Carter spread quickly through the town's tight-knit community. It wasn't long before people started whispering about the veteran and the owner. Initially, it was just a murmur among regulars at Benny's Cafe, but by mid-morning, conversations had reached the shop floor. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A few customers, usually warm and chatty, were now curt with Ethan. Longtime patrons who typically waved as they entered gave him cold stares or avoided him altogether. He noticed but shrugged it off, assuming it was a coincidence. By noon, however, it was impossible to ignore. A woman named Linda, who ran the community bulletin board and knew almost everyone, walked into the store and marched straight to Ethan. "You need to make this right, Ethan," she said bluntly, hands on her hips. Ethan blinked, confused. Make what right? James Carter. The way you treated him yesterday was wrong. He's not just some random customer. He's a veteran, and people respect him. You might not have known that, but your attitude spoke volumes. Do you realize how bad this looks? Ethan crossed his arms, defensive. I was just doing my job. I didn't mean anything by it. People are blowing this out of proportion. Maybe to you, Linda snapped. But to him and the rest of us, it wasn't just about a valve. It was about respect. Before Ethan could respond, Linda stormed out, leaving him standing there, puzzled and frustrated. Meanwhile, across town, James found himself at the center of unexpected support. Benny, the cafe owner, approached him with concern. James, I heard about what happened at Bradley's. You okay? Benny asked, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter. James sighed, reluctant to stir up more trouble. It's fine. I don't need anyone making a big deal out of it. But it is a big deal, Benny insisted. People respect you. You've earned it. What Ethan did wasn't right, and folks aren't just going to forget about it. As the day wore on, more people approached James, offering words of encouragement. While he appreciated the support, it also made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not for something like this. At the same time, Ethan found himself increasingly isolated. His employees were whispering behind his back. Chris, one of his most trusted managers, finally approached him. Ethan, we've got a problem, Chris began. The staff is talking. Customers are upset. We've had 3 people cancel orders today because of what happened with James Carter. Ethan rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just thought I was dealing with another customer. I didn't know who he was. That's the point, Chris said firmly. It shouldn't matter who he is. People are saying it was disrespectful. Whether you meant it or not, perception is reality. You need to address this. Ethan remained silent, his pride clashing with the growing awareness that he had, indeed, made a mistake. Yet, the thought of apologizing publicly made his stomach churn. On the other side, James battled his own inner turmoil. Despite his outward calm, the incident had struck a nerve. It wasn't just about Ethan's dismissive attitude. It was about all the times he had been overlooked or underestimated since returning to civilian life. His military past was a source of pride, yet now it seemed invisible to those around him. He replayed the incident in his mind, questioning whether he should have spoken up more firmly. Would it have made a difference? Or would it have confirmed whatever assumptions Ethan had made about him? At home that evening, James found himself pacing. His mind was torn between letting it go and standing up for what he believed in. His military instincts urged him to confront the problem head-on, but the civilian part of him wondered if it was worth the trouble. On the other side of town, Ethan sat in his office, wrestling with his own thoughts. His initial defensiveness was giving way to guilt, but his pride was still in the way. He didn't want to admit he had been wrong, yet deep down he knew he had. The town's growing tension was palpable, and both men felt it pressing down on them. Small interactions began to escalate into a larger narrative, one about respect, understanding, and the assumptions people make about others. The breaking point seemed inevitable. With each passing hour, the divide grew wider. James tried to retreat into his usual routines, but the lingering frustration gnawed at him. Ethan, meanwhile, found it increasingly hard to focus on running his business. Their paths were destined to cross again, and when they did, it wouldn't be a quiet exchange. Both men were being pushed toward a confrontation that neither wanted, but both needed. It was a typical Saturday morning at Benny's Cafe, but today the air buzzed with anticipation. The town was hosting its annual Veterans Appreciation Ceremony, a beloved tradition honoring local heroes. Benny had set up an outdoor seating area with a clear view of the park, where the event was taking place. Despite the tensions that had rippled through the community all week, everyone had gathered, eager to show their support. Even Ethan found himself there, though reluctantly. He had avoided the cafe for days, embarrassed by the growing resentment he faced. But today, Chris had insisted he come. "You need to see this," Chris had said earlier. "Maybe it'll give you some perspective." Ethan sighed but agreed. He sat at a table near the back, watching the crowd with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. His eyes scanned the stage, noting familiar faces from the community. The ceremony began with speeches from local officials, each thanking the veterans for their service. Then, the announcer called up James Carter. Ethan's heart sank. James walked onto the stage with a calm, steady demeanor. He wore a well-fitted suit, but it was his military insignia pin that caught everyone's attention. As he stood at the podium, the crowd erupted into applause, cheering louder than they had for anyone else. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his chest tightening. He hadn't realized just how respected James was until this moment. James began to speak, his voice steady but emotional. "I'm honored to be here today, not just as a veteran, but as someone who has called this community home for years. I served because I believed in protecting the values we hold dear: respect, dignity, and unity. Those values don't just live on the battlefield, they live here in our everyday interactions." Ethan felt a pang of guilt with every word. His mind raced back to their encounter, how dismissive he had been, how little he had known about the man standing before him. Then, James continued, "I never talk much about my past, but today I feel compelled to share something. Many of you don't know this, but during my last deployment, my team and I worked on humanitarian missions. We rebuilt schools, helped families find safety, and made it possible for businesses to thrive again in war-torn areas." Ethan's eyes widened. He remembered hearing about those missions on the news, admiring the bravery and sacrifice involved. He had no idea James had been a part of that. James paused, scanning the crowd. "We don't wear our service on our sleeves, but it's always there. And sometimes, all we ask in return is a little respect, not for what we did, but for who we are." The audience erupted into applause once more, but Ethan sat frozen. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. James wasn't just a veteran. He was a man who had dedicated his life to making the world better, even for people like Ethan, who had taken his service for granted. After the ceremony, Ethan stayed seated, watching as people surrounded James, shaking his hand and offering their thanks. For the first time in days, he felt a genuine sense of shame, one that pierced through his pride. Chris walked over and sat next to him. "Now you know," he said softly. "James isn't just a customer. He's a part of something bigger than any of us realized." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't see it before. I judged him without knowing anything about him. I was wrong." Chris placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late to make things right." Ethan took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how James would react, but he knew he had to try. He stood up and made his way through the crowd, his heart pounding with every step. As he approached James, the noise around them seemed to fade. "James," Ethan began, his voice shaky. "I need to talk to you." James turned, his expression unreadable. The crowd around them grew silent, sensing the weight of the moment. "I didn't know," Ethan continued, his eyes meeting James's. "I didn't know who you were, what you've done. And that's no excuse for how I treated you. I was wrong. I see that now, and I'm sorry." James studied him for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "It's not about knowing someone's history, Ethan. It's about treating everyone with respect, regardless of who they are or what they've done." Ethan nodded, feeling the sting of those words. "You're right. I've been so caught up in my world that I lost sight of what really matters. I can't change what I did, but I want to do better moving forward." For a few moments, James said nothing. Then he extended his hand. "Apology accepted. But remember, respect isn't just a one-time thing. It's how you live every day." Ethan shook his hand, feeling a wave of relief and humility. "Thank you," he whispered. The crowd around them began to clap, their support a powerful reminder of the community's strength. Ethan felt the shift within himself, a newfound respect not just for James, but for everyone around him. As he walked back through the cafe, he noticed familiar faces smiling at him. For the first time in days, he felt hope. The journey wasn't over, but he had taken the first step. In the days following the Veterans Appreciation Ceremony, Ethan made it his mission to show the town that his apology wasn't just words. He began by sitting down with the local Veterans Association, offering a heartfelt apology to the members he had wronged in his ignorance. It was a humbling experience for him, but one that opened his eyes to the struggles of those who had served and the deep, quiet sacrifices they had made. Ethan soon took it a step further, deciding to host a Veterans Night at his cafe. He partnered with the local veterans group, offering free meals for all veterans in town, accompanied by speeches and stories shared by the men and women who had served. He also introduced a veterans discount, giving those who had served a 25% discount every time they visited the cafe. But the gesture wasn't just about business. It was about making a lasting change in how he saw the world and the people around him. Ethan also reached out to James, asking for his support in making this new initiative a success. Together, they worked on promoting the event, not for profit, but to bring awareness to the value of honoring those who had served their country. James, though still a bit hesitant, agreed to help. For him, it wasn't about a grand apology. It was about letting go of the past and moving forward in a way that honored the struggles of both men. He shared his story at the Veterans Night, speaking candidly about the toll his service had taken on him, both physically and emotionally. His words resonated deeply with the audience, showing them that the true cost of war often lies beyond what can be seen. Through his actions, Ethan found a sense of peace. The business owner who had once dismissed veterans as just customers was now an active advocate for their rights and dignity. And the town, for the most part, had accepted his efforts, recognizing the sincerity behind them. As time passed, Ethan's cafe became a symbol of unity and respect. Veterans, along with people from all walks of life, began to visit the cafe not just for its food, but because they felt a sense of belonging there. Ethan's new behavior was evident in every conversation he had, every decision he made. No longer was he dismissive or too busy to acknowledge the worth of others. His kindness was genuine, his gratitude palpable. James, too, had changed. While he never sought public recognition, he had earned the respect of the community in a quiet, understated way. He no longer felt the weight of bitterness that had once plagued him. Instead, he focused on building relationships, not just with other veterans, but with the townspeople who had once unknowingly turned their backs on him. The Veterans Night continued, year after year, growing in size and importance. It became a local tradition, a reminder that the past could be learned from, and that respect could heal wounds. And while Ethan had once believed that his actions could never truly make up for the harm he had caused, he came to realize that the small, everyday changes he made were far more meaningful than any grand gesture. James, although initially reluctant to forgive, had come to see Ethan's transformation not just as an apology, but as an acknowledgement of the strength it took for the veteran community to continue fighting for their dignity in a world that so often overlooked their contributions. One evening, as James sat at the counter of Ethan's cafe, sipping on his usual coffee, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey they had both taken. He thought about how far they had come since that fateful encounter, how two strangers, bound by pride and misunderstanding, had found their way to mutual respect. The road had been rocky, filled with tension, anger, and moments of self-doubt. But now it was a path leading toward understanding and unity. James thought about the countless men and women who had served, who had faced similar struggles to his own. The journey wasn't always easy, but moments like this, the healing, the apology, the acceptance, made it all worthwhile. He looked over at Ethan, who was busy at the counter, smiling as he served another customer. There was no question in James's mind now. Ethan had truly transformed. It wasn't just about acknowledging the past. It was about building a future where everyone was valued and where respect didn't have to be earned through grand gestures, but through the quiet acts of kindness that defined everyday life. James felt a quiet pride in the changes that had taken place, not just in Ethan, but in himself as well. He had learned to let go of old grudges, to see beyond his own pain, and to embrace the possibility of growth and reconciliation. It wasn't easy, but it had been worth it. As the sun set on a warm summer evening, Ethan and James stood outside the cafe, shaking hands with patrons as they left. The stars were just beginning to twinkle, and the street was bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. It was a peaceful moment, one of many that would come in the future. As they stood there, side by side, the townspeople began to gather, some of them veterans, others not. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanging smiles and stories, their shared experience of the Veterans' Night bringing them closer together. In that moment, Ethan turned to James. "Thank you for sticking with me," he said quietly. "I couldn't have done this without you." James smiled, his expression warm but sincere. "We did it together," he replied. "And that's what matters." The two men shared a handshake, a gesture of solidarity, not just between them, but for the entire community. It was a symbolic ending to a story of transformation and healing, one that would continue to resonate for years to come. And as the town celebrated, it became clear that this was just the beginning, a new chapter where respect and understanding, rather than pride and prejudice, would guide their lives.